problem is now I'm going to talk very, very loud. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So anyway, thank you again to BIOS. Thank you to the organizers, students for coming, and for the faculty who have agreed to come. This thing is sensitive. There we go. Okay, a very little bit about myself before I get started. I am a professor in the School of Biology at the Goergia Institute of Technology. Goergia Institute of Technology, or Goergia Tech, is located in Atlanta, Georgia. This is my laboratory webpage. So we call it a lab. But it's actually just a room like this full of computers. It's a dry lab, so we have a bioinformatics and genomics lab. And we do research and development on transposable elements, epigenomics, and gene regulation. That's really about the human genome, and I'll talk about some of our work on the human genome on Thursday. We do work on computational genomics for public health. We have some colleagues from SEEB here, and we've been working closely with them to develop computational methods for public health. And I do a lot of work on development of bioinformatics capacity in Latin America. So I was invited to Colombia the first time in 2007 to work with Colciencias. At that time, the Colombian government decided to invest in genomics and bioinformatics, and what you see here is very much a result of that decision to invest in those fields. And I think that was very forward-thinking of Colombia, and I think it will allow the country to position itself as a leader in these fields in the entire region, really all of Latin America. And so I feel very fortunate to have been a very small part of those efforts. I'm also director of the Bioinformatics Graduate Program, so this is really for the students. One of the things we're really trying to do at Goergia Tech, there's a big interest in international relations. So if students are interested, we have the first graduate program in bioinformatics in the USA, I think the first one in the world. We have two programs. We have a professional science master's program and a master's program in bioinformatics. This is aimed at getting people ready for the workforce in bioinformatics. And then we have a PhD program, which is a more traditional research-driven program in bioinformatics. So we have about 70 students and about 50 faculty members all over the university that are involved in this program. I'm also the co-founder and the co-director of the Pan American Bioinformatics Institute. One of the things I learned last night at dinner is that we have a lot of Peruvians here. Peruvians, get your hand up. So which Peruvian can tell us where that is? Where is that? Parque del Amor in Miraflores in Lima. So Leonardo and I had the fortune of teaching a course there at Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia in Lima in the year of 2012. So what is the Pan American Bioinformatics Institute? We call it an institute, but it's really more of a network. We call it PABI for short. So PABI is a network of like-minded scientists in the United States and Latin America who want to use science, in particular biotechnology, genomics and bioinformatics, as a tool in service of humanity. And I know that's a very lofty goal, but we're taking little steps to get there. So the idea is that we want to leverage biotechnology for public health and for economic development. And when we talk about public health, we're working in two areas. So one is genomic medicine, where we're focusing on the analysis of human genome sequences, and the other is more on molecular epidemiology, the work that we're doing in collaboration with SEEB, where we're developing and applying tools for the analysis of microbial genome sequences. Now again, students, this might interest you because we do three things through the Pan American Bioinformatics Institute. One of those is collaborative research that we've already talked about, and we're collaborating with BIOS on a number of projects. The other one is we do courses, short courses and workshops, exactly like we're doing here. And the third thing for the students is that we do a lot of exchanges. So we do bilateral exchanges, students from the US going to Colombia, last year, one of my own students, Lava Rishishwar, was here at BIOS for a number of weeks, and he was helping them develop a platform for the analysis of human genome sequence. Juan Esteban and Isaura, who are here, are going to give talks, did pasantillas, did internships at Goergia Tech last year. So we've had about 20 or 30 students that have come on international exchanges. And so this isn't only my laboratory, and it isn't only Goergia Tech. What we do is we serve kind of as a matchmaker. So we talk to people, we figure out what their interests are, what their needs are, and then if we have colleagues in the United States who are interested in participating, we can match them up with those students. And one of the great successes of the exchange program is that 5 of our students are now matriculated. 5 students that came on exchanges are now PhD students at Goergia Tech. So students, if you go on an exchange and you work hard and you do a good job, those professors will say, and they say this to me, I want that student to come back and work in my lab. So this is something that we're really happy about. So Poppy is one of the sponsors of this program. Ooh. Okay, so as I said, I'm a professor, right? So I'm interested in pedagogy, right? So what is this? This is the branch of philosophy that deals with the theory and practice of education, right? So pedagogy is all about what are the best practices for teaching, okay? So don't worry, I'm not going to give a whole talk about pedagogy, but what I want to do is I want to impart on you what our philosophy is, how it is that we intend to teach this course, okay? So I'm going to talk today about what we're going to cover in the course, and then I'm going to talk about what is the approach that we will take to teach that material. And again, the big hint here is that active participation of the students and interaction of the faculty will be crucial for our success. And with that in mind, that's why Leonardo has organized everything so well. We're all in the hotel together, we have lunch program together, we have dinner program together, so there should be lots of opportunities for one-on-one interaction. And students, at any time, if you have questions for faculty or organizers of the course, come up to us, grab us, and we can talk about anything at any time. And these are not the only faculty that will be teaching in the course. There'll be a number of other faculty members that are coming later in the week, and you'll have lots of chances to talk with them. So, having said all of that, this is the outline for the talk. So I'm going to talk first about the course. What is the theme of the course? What are our goals as organizers of the course? What is it that we want to achieve? What is it that we want the students to take away from the course? What is the structure of instruction that we're going to use to be able to achieve those goals? And finally, I'm just going to briefly go over the schedule. You have that with you, so I won't belabor that. Having said all of that, I'm then going to give an overview of high performance and cloud computing for bioinformatics. This is going to be a little bit superficial, but what I want to do is I want to touch on the main themes regarding what is high performance computing and what is bioinformatics, and how are those two things different and how are they similar, and how does that relate to how you guys will do your work. So let's start first then with something about the course, okay? So this is very much my biased perspective as a bioinformatics professor, but what is happening, and I've actually seen this change in my own career, is that as with physics in the 20th century, biology in the 21st century is rapidly becoming an information science. So what we have is experiments in biology have gone high throughput. So things that we used to do to get the sequence of 1 or 2 genes, or to get the expression of a handful of genes at a time, we can now do at massive scale. So we can sequence entire genomes. We can now sequence scores or hundreds of genomes. We can measure the expression of the whole transcriptome. And even more complex, we can measure many different kinds of interactions, genetic interactions, protein-protein interactions, metabolic interactions, at a very, very large scale, okay? So that's the good news. The bad news is that when you do these kinds of experiments, you are left with a huge amount of data, right? So all of us have probably heard about this notion of big data. We're in the era of big data. Well, that big data, that information alone is worthless. That's just my opinion. And what all of us as biologists must be able to do, whether you are a bioinformaticist or an experimentalist working at the bench, you must be able to convert information into knowledge. To me, that is really the essence of bioinformatics, okay? So to do this, obviously, we have to rely on computers, hardware, software, and that's what they're doing at BIOS, and that's very exciting, okay? So bioinformatics, for me, again, occupies the intersection of the life sciences and computer science. And the goal of bioinformatics is to convert information into knowledge via computational approaches. So one of the things, one professional highlight for me is that Sir Richard Roberts visited our laboratory. I don't know if you know who Richard Roberts is, but he's a Nobel laureate, and he's the guy that discovered introns, right? So can't get much more fundamental than that. But he was also a pioneer of bioinformatics. And so he came to the lab, and the students wanted to know, what should we be thinking about? What should we be learning about? What's the future? And his answer was very simple. He said, you should always strive to put the bio in bioinformatics, right? And that seems trivial, but it's actually not trivial, because sometimes we get caught up in the computational approaches, the algorithmic elegance, and we lose sight of the biology, right? So what we want to try to do throughout this course is put the bio in bioinformatics. And for me, again, that is the idea of taking raw information and converting it into knowledge, okay? Now, high-performance computing, and these are very simple definitions, is the use of supercomputers and parallel processing, and that will come up a number of times in this course, for solving complex computational problems. Cloud computing, again, very, very simply, and we'll go into this in a lot more detail, in the most simple sense, it simply means storing and accessing data and programs over the internet, instead of locally on your own computer's hard drive, okay? So the cloud, in a certain sense, is just a metaphor for the internet, but it actually means much more than that. And that's one of the things that I really want to try to define in this talk. What is HPC? What is cloud computing? The two are definitely not mutually exclusive. Where do they intersect? How are they the same? Where do they differ, okay? And then implicit in that, for you as working biologists, will mean, what are the implications of that for my own work, okay? So, what are the goals for the course? What is it that we want you to take away? So when you apply for a course at ICGEB, you have to say, I want to do a theoretical course or I want to do a practical course. And Leonardo and I said, no, we want to do both at once, okay? So that might be a little bit ambitious. The theory that we want you to take away is that you, the students or the participants, should understand the basic, emphasis on basic, because this is really a practical course, the basic theoretical underpinnings of high performance and cloud computing. So we will talk a little bit about theory here, but only to the extent that the theory informs your use of these tools to address biological questions, and that will be key. Now, the practice for us is the big part. So the students, when you leave here, we really want you to be able to apply high performance and cloud computing tools and techniques to do your research right away following the course, okay? In the US, sometimes we call this a hot start. We will put in your hands tools that you should be able to use right away for your own work, okay? So we're gonna provide you a specific roadmap, a specific set of tools and instructions, and then later, as you become more skilled at the use of this technology, you can begin to adopt those tools to your own needs. Okay, so you can change them as you like. And what you'll see is that there are many, many different approaches to high-performance computing, many platforms for cloud computing, and we are agnostic with respect to which ones you choose. We'll tell you about which ones we think are best and how you can get started, but ultimately those decisions will be up to you. Okay. Alright, so this is sort of my idea of how things are going to work here. So AM is morning time. So what we're trying to do here is really two things. We're trying to give you, the morning are sort of more traditional lecture sessions where we talk about research domain specific areas. So the idea here is we'll talk about PC and cloud computing, but we'll also talk about our own research and what are the needs, what are the demands of our research, what does our research entail with respect to high performance computing, okay? So these will be faculty talks. We're also going to have student talks, and again, the idea there is to facilitate interaction between faculty and students and participation. And then in the afternoons, we're going to have practical exercises in HPC and cloud computing. And we're starting today with Jorge Duitama in the afternoon. So we will come back here in the afternoon. You all have your laptops, we have Wi-Fi, and the instructors will give you very specific instructions on how to do different things in HPC and cloud computing related back to the specific research domain areas. So for example, the theme of the day today is plant genomics, which is very big in Colombia, and Jorge will be giving you instructions on how to do stuff that are related to the theme of plant genomics, which you'll also talk about this morning. Now, in the middle here is student-faculty interaction and wrapping the whole thing up. And again, I will say this over and over, the course will only be as successful as the depth of the interactions that we have. Okay, so students, we're counting on you to reach out to us, and we're excited about that. So, again, our pedagogy is grounded in active learning, student participation, and student-faculty interaction will be critical to the success of the course. We need your help with that. I want you to be active, not passive learners, and we're a small group, as you can see. I think we had over 100 applications. So students, you can consider yourself to be the elite of the elite because we accepted you to come here. But we wanted to keep it small on purpose to facilitate that interaction. Okay, so you guys have the schedule in front of you. I'm not going to belabor that too much, but again, we have the morning sessions with lectures. Today's theme is plant genomics, and then we have the afternoon sessions with specific exercises. One thing I do want to point out that tomorrow morning, so students, participants, you received an email from us asking if you wanted to give talks, so we'll see some of those. We're very excited about that. But before we get into the student talks, we're going to have a faculty student roundtable. So in the morning session tomorrow, we're just going to sit here and we're going to talk. We want to hear who you are, what you're working on, what your big questions are, what your needs are, and then hopefully that will allow us to be more responsive to you. So we'll do that tomorrow. We have someone coming from Booz Allen that's going to talk about Amazon Web Services, which I think is fair to say for the moment is definitely the industry leader in any kind of cloud computing, but also cloud computing for bioinformatics. Yes.
We're going to have that roundtable at 11 or 11:30.
Uh-huh. Good. We will add that to the schedule. But that will be important. That will allow us to chat. Then the third day, we're going to get into high-performance computing and bioinformatics in Colombia. We're going to have 2 sessions of those. So we're fortunate enough to have 2 professors from Los Andes who will come. In the afternoon, we'll actually hear about a cloud computing platform that is developed here in Colombia. So one of the things that we want to do here is emphasize local tools that are available. Because when you're working on the cloud and you're working remotely, there's a lot of instructions online. They try to tell you how to do everything. But personally, I really believe in FaceTime. So having that personal interaction is really a strength. So having a resource like BIOS here locally is a real strength for doing work because you can get on the phone, you can call them, you can speak Spanish, and I think that's a real strength. And eClouds is an example of that. It's a cloud computing platform being developed at Los Andes. Myself and Fred Vanberg, he's another professor from Georgia Tech, are going to go into human genomics on day 4, and Dr. Vanberg is going to talk about BaseSpace. This is a new platform. It's cloud computing for bioinformatics and genomics that is coupled with Illumina. So if any of you have done genomics, you know that Illumina is the industry leader in genomics. And this great thing about BaseSpace, and Dr. Vanberg will go into this, is that if you do any sequencing with Illumina, you have free access to this platform. And the data never has to come to you. So one of the rate-limiting steps about high-performance computing and cloud computing for bioinformatics is moving the data back and forth, right? We generate huge data sets, and moving it can be very slow. The model with BaseSpace is that you sequence your genome at Illumina, and it stays there, and the sequencing is coupled with the applications. So this is a very new and very powerful approach. And then finally, we will hear from BIOS on the last day. And then I should have, and I will now, really acknowledge and thank all of the students that have agreed to give talks, Yasna and Miguel, and the last day, Sylvia and Torgay on day 4, Isaura, Juan Esteban on day 3. So we're really grateful to all of you. We appreciate you guys offering to do that. We really think that that will help facilitate and foment student-faculty interactions, and again, allow us to be more responsive to your needs. Okay. Now, having said all of that, now I'm going to give an overview of high-performance computing and cloud computing. Again, this is a bit of a high-level overview, but my goal here is simply to try and set the stage for what it is that we're going to teach in this course, and also to hopefully try and alleviate some confusion about what cloud computing is, and again, how it relates to high-performance computing. So this notion of cloud computing is kind of new, as bioinformatics is new, and so anytime you kind of have a new field, it takes a while for things to settle down with respect to what the meanings are, what the definitions are, what the standards are. So there's some disagreement, and that's normal, and there's even some skepticism, and we'll talk about that, regarding what cloud computing is, and again, that's totally fine. But I think what we can do at this point, given the extent to which the field has developed, is that we can settle together on some very specific operational definitions regarding what high-performance computing is, what cloud computing is, and how they relate. And using those operational definitions as a platform or as a launching pad, then we can understand how and when is it that I would want to use traditional high-performance computing for my own needs, how and when would I want to use cloud computing, and how and when would I want to use some sort of hybrid approach for both of those. Okay? So that's the idea with that. Now, having said that, I started at the outset, I said I wanted this to be as interactive as possible, and then I just started running away talking. So before I go anywhere else, I want to have some questions, comments, concerns from the students. Who has a question? Anyone? Students, I know it's the first day, so it's hard to be called out. Yes?
I think you said that we are going to deal with that.
Yes.
How about another type?
So solid, my recommendation for the users of solid, well, take this in two parts. First of all, great question, and also thank you for going first. So the first part is that as bioinformaticists, we are very much agnostic with respect to the source of our data, right? So what that means is that there are different sequencing platforms. We're not sequencing vendors, we're not sequencing providers, we're not saying Illumina is the best, you should go with that. So ultimately, these sequences will be converted to FASTQ files, and if you don't know what FASTQ files are, we'll probably hear about that, but there's one standard format for sequence data and quality data. Once you get to that standard format, then you can use any and all of these tools. So we can use Solid, we can use 454, we can use Ion, we can use Illumina, the new ones that are coming, PacBio, Oxford Nanopore, some very exciting developments. The bioinformatics community is very flexible and very open with respect to the use of different tools. Now, having said all of that, a couple quick caveats. The first one is that this space is evolving very, very rapidly. So things come and go fast. So for example, you may or may not know that we used to talk about next generation sequencing, right? So sequencing technology stayed the same for about 30 years, at least the basic biochemistry, until 2004, and then there were about 10 new biochemistries invented. So we talked about next generation sequencing, faster, higher throughput, cheaper, and of course, who knows what the first next generation sequencing platform was? What was the first one? Someone in here knows. What was the very first platform that developed for next generation sequencing? Jorge. Well, Sanger would be the old one, right? So, pyrosequencing, also known as 454. So 454 was next generation sequencing. That was the future. We were extraordinarily excited about that. What has happened with 454 now? It's no longer supported, right? Se acabó, se fue. It's gone. So we don't talk about next generation sequencing anymore. We talk about second generation and third generation. Second generation sequencing was high throughput but pretty shorter reads, and third generation hopefully will be the holy grail, which will be high throughput and longer reads. So having said that, 454 is obsolete, and I have to tell you that I'm very sorry, but solid is pretty much going obsolete too. So now the issue is that if you have a solid in your institution or your collaborators are still using solid, you can still use it. You will be charged with doing the first step. Solid is in color space, right? And you'll have to convert that to get that to FASTQ, and then you can use all the downstream files. But the reason why I'm saying that, and the reason why I want to be very transparent, is because students, when you're planning your future work, you want to use the best platforms and the ones that are going to have the most bioinformatics support. And for now, that will be Illumina. So things like 454 and solid, you want to stay away from. That's just my 2 cents. Good question. Other questions? Organizers? Anything? Okay. All right, so now let's move on to the overview of high performance and cloud computing. I spent too long on that question, and now it's stuck. Okay. Is it going now? Yes, good. Thank you, Patricia. Okay, so just some very, very basics about HPC. So we're going to start to crawl first. That's to say we're going to start to go slow, then we're going to walk, and hopefully by the end of the course we'll be running. But we got to start with the basics, right? So fundamental to high performance computing. Oh, before I get into this, I kind of want to take a census of the students to know the level that I'm talking about. So students, if your training is in biology, and my training is in biology, I have an undergrad degree in biology and a PhD in genetics. I'm not a computer scientist. Students, if you are a biologist, let me see your hand. Get them up high, 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 and down. Students, if you are a computer scientist, information systems engineer, let me see your hand. Okay. Good. Some people didn't put their hands up. Okay, good. All right, so we're mostly biologists. I'm speaking to you as a biologist. That's my frame of reference. So let's start with the simple thing. The client-server architecture is fundamental to both HPC and cloud computing, and it's common to both of them. And the idea is very, very simple. What you have in front of you, your laptops, are the clients. So we have clients here. A client can be a laptop. Now it can be a cell phone or an iPad or something like that. You log in remotely from your client to the server, okay? So what that means is that the heavy lifting of the computation is done on the server side. And the server architecture, again, very simple and superficial, is that you have application servers, which are really running the programs. They're doing the heavy work of the processing. And then behind, if you will, the application servers are the database managers and the data, okay? And so this paradigm by now is very, very well established, and it's set up. And the nice thing about this is and cloud computing, and one of the things that excites me about the notion of doing bioinformatics as an exercise for capacity development for science in Latin America is that bioinformatics has the potential to be a democratizing force in science. Why do I say that? Because with what you have in front of you, with your laptops, you can really do good bioinformatics, right? So all you need to do really high-performance bioinformatics is a half-decent laptop and a good internet connection. So it really has the potential to be a democratizing force. Now, of course, the heavy lifting is done on the back end. So we have folks like BIOS to thank for providing this platform that can allow for and facilitate the democratization of science through bioinformatics. But this is one thing that I think is really exciting and students should understand. Genomics and these high throughput experimental techniques are very, very expensive, and they're typically done by big groups, consortia, and they may be out of the reach of smaller labs that are trying to build capacity in Latin America or in the developing world. But bioinformatics is not, okay? It can be done relatively inexpensively. And I think that the client-server architecture has much to do with that. Okay, so quick overview of HPC. So when we talk about high-performance computing, we're talking about supercomputer clusters, okay? So what is a cluster? A cluster is a single logical unit that is made up of multiple computers that are linked through a LAN, okay? A LAN is a local area network, okay? And so this could be something really, really simple. So this is like a first generation supercomputer where people just took their own PCs and they linked them up and they built their own clusters. So we have something as simple as that. And again, the folks at SEEB are doing something analogous to this. I think it's quite ambitious. They're building their own cluster, maybe a little bit more sophisticated than this, but it's the same idea. They're sort of doing it in their garage, and I really like that pioneering spirit, all the way up to these really, really high-performance centers like we have here at BIOS. This one on the right here is called Titan. That's at Oak Ridge National Laboratories in Tennessee, and we have a nascent partnership with them. So one of the things I want to say is that they're very interested in the development of bioinformatics capacity in Latin America, and they are interested and willing, in principle, to provision resources for that. So that's one thing I want you guys to keep in mind. So what a cluster does, very simply, is it allows for much faster processing speed, more storage capacity, better data integrity, better reliability, and wider availability of resources that you can get with a single mainframe, right? Kind of the old model of supercomputing, okay? So that's the good news about clusters. The bad news, this kind of flies in the face of my previous comment about democratization of science, is that clusters are much more costly to implement and maintain, okay? And so the folks at BIOS know this very well. This results in a much higher overhead for running a cluster than running a single machine, okay? And this is where cloud computing comes in. So keep that in mind. That's one of the real distinctions between traditional HPC and cloud computing. With cloud computing, if you're starting a small project, your needs will be very dynamic. They might start small and then they might get bigger. And you might not want to invest in the overhead of developing your own HPC infrastructure. And if that's the case, what you can do is you can leverage cloud computing platforms and resources like those available at BIOS to do your work and set up your project in a way that's very dynamic. And Hassan Huda will talk specifically about that with Amazon Web Services. So, parallel computing, you've got these clusters. It's a bunch of small computers linked up to one big computer. In order to be able to effectively analyze your data with that architecture, you must use parallel computing, okay? And parallel computing, again, quite simply, is a type of computing architecture in which several processors execute or process an application or computation simultaneously, okay? So what this does is that it helps you to perform large computations by taking a big problem and breaking it down into small problems. It's in sort of constituent chunks or units, if you will. And the way this is done is by dividing the workload between more than one processor, all of which work through the computation at the same time. Now, the challenge there is how is it that you parallelize? That is to say, how is it that you take this big problem and break it down into smaller problems? And depending on what your particular application is in bioinformatics, some of these problems are more or less amenable to parallelization. That is to say that some of these problems can be easily parallelized while others are more difficult. So for example, one of the main exercises in any genomic analysis is a sequence similarity search. I've got a bunch of these sequences and I want to know what they are. That is a problem that is very readily parallelized because you can take each part of your sequence and you can search it separately against a database, or each sequence and search it separately. On the flip side of that, if you're doing something like assembly, where many different sequence fragments have to talk to each other, and it's sort of a meta problem the parallelization there could be a little bit less trivial. And so that's one thing you'll have to consider. So here's a sort of very a simple schematic of how it is that parallelization works. So you have a series of individual nodes in your cluster. Those can be individual units. They can be individual racks. Each node has its own local memory. The allocation of memory will be absolutely critical in high-performance computing processes, along with the number of processing cores, okay? So again, you have to split your problem up so that it can be run, different chunks can be run independently, and then integrated through that local area network, okay? So really, almost all supercomputers, and probably in bioinformatics, all of the ones that you will use, employ parallel computing principles to operate, okay? So we also call that parallel processing. So now, finally, to close out, moving on to cloud computing. So what is cloud computing? How is it that cloud computing is related to high-performance computing? And importantly, how is it that it differs from traditional high-performance computing? And how is it that that will inform your own work? So, if you want to hear something really funny, I urge you to go to this YouTube link. So all of these slides, I believe, will be available for the participants. So this is Larry Ellison. So if you're an aficionado of computer science, you might know who Larry Ellison is. He's the CEO of Oracle, and he's a famously outspoken and controversial guy. So what is Oracle? Oracle is the business or industry standard database. It's kind of the standard for running big data, high performance, business standard applications. And Oracle is not cheap. It's very, very expensive. And Oracle for years enjoyed predominance in the market. And then all of a sudden, as things happen in our field, when things started to change, there were lots of challengers to Oracle. There was MySQL, other database platforms, and then along came cloud computing. And so you have to take this comment with a grain of salt. But again, I really urge you to listen to this because it's quite funny. It looks strong here, but when you hear him say it, it's even stronger. But the idea here was that this was in the context of an interview, and the notion was, Larry, your business model is really going to be threatened by cloud computing, and how are you going to adapt to this changing technological environment? And his response was that essentially, cloud computing means nothing because cloud computing means everything. And so his response was to say, we're not going to lose our industry share because we're already doing cloud computing, and we've been doing cloud computing for years. And I can't think of anything that cloud computing is. And he says that the computer industry, and this is actually, I think I would tend to agree with him, and this is one thing you want to be aware of, is more fashion-driven than women's fashion. Maybe I'm an idiot, but I have no idea what anyone is talking about. What is it? It's complete gibberish. It's insane. When is this idiocy going to stop? This was 2008. We're in 2015. The idiocy obviously has not stopped, right? Cloud computing has taken off. I think Oracle and Larry Ellison are doing quite fine with their business model, so they've adapted. So go to that link. The other thing is, if you go to that link, there's a bunch of other interviews with him, and he's equally controversial, equally outspoken, and it's interesting to get that industry perspective. This is the skeptical view of cloud computing. And as I mentioned before, 2008 is a while ago, but in a sense, cloud computing is still in its infancy. So it's very natural to have these kinds of disagreements. It's very natural for things to take some time to settle down. So we may or may not still be in that phase of settling down. But again, for the purposes of this course, and for the purposes of bioinformatics, we can settle or decide on some very clear operational definitions that will then help to inform the kinds of decisions that you want to make when you're analyzing your data, or when you're starting a project, or when you're thinking about developing your own local HPC tools, or provisioning cloud resources, or adopting some kind of hybrid model, okay? So I will close out the talk by trying to do that, okay? And so there's a government entity in the United States called the National Institute of Standards. So a few years after Larry Ellison's provocative comment, they decided to get together and they put this special definition, this special publication out, which is the Nist, National Institute of Standards and Technology, definition of cloud computing. And the idea with this was that it would be a means for a broad comparison of cloud services, because what you'll see is that there's a huge proliferation of cloud services. And a big decision all of you will have to make is which one do I want to choose and why. So they wanted to compare the cloud services that were coming out, and again, just like I'm trying to do here, provide a baseline for discussion on what cloud computing is and how is it that it's used. And in order to do that, and I'll go through each one of these briefly, they define 3 categories of concepts that encapsulate the essence of what cloud computing is, okay? These are the essential characteristics of cloud computing, the service models of cloud computing, and the development models of cloud computing. So let's look briefly at what each one of those is. So, according again to Nist, and I think this has been pretty much widely adopted by the industry, the essential characteristics of cloud computing are the following. On-demand self-service. And this is the greatest thing about cloud computing, is that cloud computing leverages existing resources, servers that are already out there, Amazon, Google, they're sitting there, they've got idle CPU time, they are ready for use 24/7. So whenever you're ready to go, they're ready to go. They're on demand and they're self-service, and you'll see about that today. Broad network access. So again, one of the big rate-limiting steps in genomics and bioinformatics research, high-performance computing, and on the cloud is moving the data from place to place. So, in the spirit of capacity building and democratization of science in the developing world, which is ICGB is all about, these guys provide really, really broad network access. But the caveat there is that your network access is only as good as your smallest point, right? So you will need, I'm saying that anyone can do bioinformatics with a laptop using the cloud model, but you will need a decent internet connection. And that, I know, could be an issue, and that could be one of the limits. On the cloud end, they provide broad network access. On the local end, you should do it. And I know that there are academic networks. I think Renata is one of them. And there might be other networks that my Colombian colleagues know about that they could share with you, that you could tap into in order to be able to enjoy the benefit of the broadband network access on the cloud side. Right? Because again, if you're going up to the cloud and you are relying on their broadband network access and trying to benefit from that, if you have a little narrowband down here, you're just stuck. Okay. Resource pooling, this is also a great thing. All these huge companies, again, like Amazon and Google, had all of these resources. Sometimes they're using them, sometimes they're not. Why not put them together and pool them for other folks' use? Rapid elasticity. This is another real benefit, and this means that you can rapidly change your configuration, and this relies on a very important concept called virtualization, and I'll talk a little bit about that today, and we'll hear a lot more about that. And again, what that means is that, imagine you have a small startup project, and you're thinking about provisioning your own HPC resource in your lab. I want to buy a big server or make my own cluster. That has a very defined and finite amount of resources. So you may start off and you may invest in way more resources than you need. That might not be cost effective. Then you might start getting a lot of data and you might quickly outpace the resources you have. And as you know, processing power is getting faster and faster, and memory is getting cheaper and cheaper all of the time. The cloud model is that you have a very dynamic provisioning of resources. So you can set up your cloud instance, and I'll tell you what that means, in such a way that it can grow and shrink dynamically with the needs of your data. So rapid elasticity is a very important aspect of cloud computing, and something that sets it aside from the traditional HPC model where you have a finite, defined amount of computational resources that you will then go into and use. You may only use a little bit, you may fill it all the way up, you might outpace the needs. Cloud computing, you could start small and you could grow and shrink as the demands of your data and the demands of your analysis entail. Very, very important key point. And then measured service, which simply means that you are only provisioning resources, and really the bottom line is you're only paying for what you need. So as that resource grows and expands, you're only paying for the services you need. So this again can be an advantage for small labs or folks working in the developing world because you're only using the resources that you need. And again, this is cloud computing, but a place like BIOS, which is traditional high-performance computing, can very well provision the same resources, right? So if BIOS is partnering with academic collaborators, they can set up access to the resource so that they can expand and shrink dynamically according to their needs, and set up a collaborative or an economic model that's the same as that. Okay, so that's where the HPC and the cloud computing come together there. So those are the essential characteristics. These are the service models of cloud computing, and there's sort of three different aspects of this. There's software as a service, there's platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. Okay, and then each one gets a little more progressively in-depth with respect to the extent of the resources that you're leveraging from the cloud provider and the depth of your own interaction or participation in that process. Okay, so the first one is software as a service. Software as a service, SaaS. So the idea there is that this is quite simply the capability to use the cloud provider's applications remotely over the network. Okay, so that means you have the opportunity to use their applications. You as the user, you don't manage the server, you don't manage the operating system, the storage, or even the application capabilities, okay? And the good thing about bioinformatics is it's such an open source field, right? So there's this philosophy of open source development in bioinformatics. What that means for cloud computing for bioinformatics is that many of the standard applications are already out there. So with BaseSpace, they're already there. With Amazon Web Services, with Galaxy, that's a big one. So not all, but many of the things that you might want to do in bioinformatics can run on the software as a service model, meaning you don't even need to worry about BLAST or Bowtie or your Velvet, your favorite assembly algorithm. They're all out there. The next one is platform as a service. Now, many of the things we do as bioinformaticists, we like to develop our own tools. And importantly, I really want to get this across to you all, in using cloud computing, you can use their tools, but you can also use your own tools. So there is a place for custom development, okay? Is that clear to everyone? So you can use your own software tools, your own algorithms, your own pipelines, and that's the platform as a service model. So this is the capability to deploy and use your applications on the infrastructure that's made available by the cloud provider, okay? So in that case, you have control over your own applications and their configuration, but again, you don't manage the servers, you don't manage the operating system, and you don't manage the storage, okay? So I've spoken a lot about sort of the economic benefits and the overhead benefits of using cloud computing. One of the things I neglected to mention is that there is much less overhead in terms of systems administration, right? So you don't have to manage your own system, you don't have to manage your operating system, and for myself as a faculty member, for example, I hate when my graduate students have to waste time on systems administration, right? Because I want them doing their analysis. And for you guys as students, I know you want to be doing your analysis too. You don't want to be doing systems administration. So the platform really all of these models have the benefit of severely reduced overhead in terms of systems administration, right? You don't have to manage the servers, the OS, anything like that. There is a steep learning curve at first, but that's what we're going to help you with during this course. Once you have managed that steep learning curve, then you have much less overhead. And then finally, the last service model is infrastructure as a service. And that's the capability to provision the computing resources, storage, networking. Storage is a big one, right? So with genome sequences, you can rapidly fill up storage. And Amazon and these guys are developing these huge storage farms. Sometimes they call them storage lakes. And they have different models of storage. So they have more cost-effective models whereby you can store a lot more data that you don't need to access rapidly, or they have a little more kind of pricey or boutique models for storage of data that you want to access rapidly. So there's by now at least 3 different tiers of storage with respect to how rapidly you can access the data. And again, that has important economic implications for what we want to do in science, because science costs money. And again, you have virtual control over the resources, but not the physical infrastructure. So each one of these entails sort of a higher level of interaction and investment from the user. And then you have the service models of cloud computing. And so these are kind of important with respect to operational definitions, but in terms of your own work, they're less important because the boundaries between these different models really become totally blurred. So you have the private cloud. The private cloud is what it sounds like. You have a company or some entity that has their own sequestered cloud, and they're using that as a resource, but the idea, again, is to pool everything centrally to reduce the overhead for systems administration. Then you have a community cloud, which is not totally public, but is something that is shared between a community. So if BIOS were to provision their HPC resources using a cloud model, that might be something like a community cloud, where there would be a community, an academic community of scientists that could access the resources of BIOS in a cloud model, and they'd be kind of a community. Public is a cloud that's open to anyone, so Amazon Web Services or Google would be something like that. And then there's hybrids, which combine any and all of these different models. Now, cloud computing, you may or may not have heard of this concept of commodity computing. It's very, very similar to cloud computing, but not exactly the same, so I just wanted to touch on that a little bit to try to alleviate confusion. The similarity between cloud computing and commodity computing is that commodity computing, they use large numbers of already available computing components for parallel computing to get the greatest amount of use at the lowest cost. And that, of course, is exactly the same as the cloud computing model. So it's done in commodity computers which are big, industry standard computers, as opposed to high-cost supercomputers or boutique computers. And the key about commodity computing, and this is kind of just for your information, this will probably not be so relevant for your work, but maybe for the folks at BIOS that are making decisions about how to grow or expand, this is relevant. So I wanted to include that because the emphasis on the business side for commodity computing is that the systems are manufactured by multiple vendors that incorporate standards, incorporate components that are based on open standards, okay? So this is kind of like the opposite of the Oracle model, right? I talked about Oracle. So the idea here is that the business people have realized that it actually behooves them to some extent to embrace open standards, because then their software or their hard components can be plugged in here, plugged in there, or plugged in there, okay? And so those are what we call commodity components, and that's what commodity, really the kind of the essence of commodity computing, where it sort of diverges from cloud computing, because cloud computing, while it has in common with commodity computing the use of pooled resources, it may or may not represent commodity computing. That will be totally opaque to you, the user. You don't need to worry about that. But I think it is relevant to the mission of BIOS. So these are what they call commodity components. They're manufactured by vendors, but they're open source. So you're not reliant on one particular vendor. You can pick and choose from different vendors. There's a standardization process, and what that standardization process entails, again, is a reduction of cost and a reduction of differentiation amongst the vendors' products. So that's what commodity computing is, and that's how it relates to cloud computing. Now, cloud computing, the development was made possible by the convergence of three existing technologies. The internet, and so remember that the first sort of simple definition that they gave of cloud computing was a metaphor for the internet, okay? And that gets into a little bit of dangerous territory, like cloud computing is everything. But it's more than that, and we could be more specific. And these two other aspects then bring in that specificity. There's virtualization, which is very important. So the internet, of course, goes back to the 60s, and then we have standard protocols for data transfer that came up in the 80s, and then availability to the public in the 90s. Virtualization also goes back to the 60s, but it really didn't become mainstream until the early 2000s, okay? So the idea with virtualization, and I'll get into a little bit more detail briefly about it, is that what you are doing is you're creating a virtual machine, right? So let's, again, take BIOS as an example. BIOS has a big supercomputer, one of the most powerful in Latin America. They have all of these resources, and that supercomputer, as I showed you what a supercomputer is a cluster of individual units. And each unit has its own configuration, and the cluster has its own special configuration. So if you were to use BIOS resources in a classic HPC model, you would be bound to the physical configuration of the machine. You would use X number of nodes, X number of processors, a certain operating system, and so on and so forth. Virtualization differs from the traditional HPC model is in that you create a virtual instance. So you're actually creating a little mini computer inside the big computer. And that's where the dynamics, the elasticity, the rapid changes of cloud computing come. So you create your own you provision resources, you bundle them into a little package. It comes with its own operating system, it comes with all the dependencies, it comes with all of the programs, and it comes with all of the data. So it would be as if you're running your own little mini BIOS computer from your laptop. And this is where the HPC, it's a little bit tricky, and I want to make sure we get this. This is where the traditional HPC and cloud model diverge, and it's also where they simultaneously converge. Okay, so again, I'll repeat that. They diverge in the sense that if you create your own HPC machine, a physical machine, and you use it locally, you are bound by the physical parameters of that, the operating system, the configuration of the cluster, the nodes, and so on and so forth. Whereas, if you virtualize and you use the cloud model, you are creating what we call an instance, which is your own little mini computer inside that bigger supercomputer. And that allows you to custom design your resource to fit your own needs, and it allows you to expand and contract as the dictates of your data and analysis require. Okay? And I'll get into that in a little more detail. That's one of the most important things I want to get across. So virtualization is by now very standard. And then, of course, parallel computing. So multiprocessors, again, going back to the 60s, again, a really critical development, and all these are the standards that we use to pass data from one place to the other, right? So for the internet, we have to pass it from the client to the server, and when we're talking about clusters, we have to partition the data and then split it up to different cluster nodes on the cluster, run the job, and then bring it back together. So the standards for doing that in the case of parallel computing, it's the message passing interface, were developed in the early 90s. And then something very important, I'm not going to talk about this today, is the Hadoop MapReduce paradigm, and I think Asan Huda is going to talk about that, which is a very important paradigm for parallelization, which allows us to do high performance computing much faster and at much lower cost with respect to computational resources and economic costs. So the convergence of these three technologies was what allowed for the emergence of cloud computing. Okay? And I'm going to close out very soon here. So this is a comparison of the traditional HPC model versus the cloud model. And again, the message here, and I know it's a little bit complicated, is that they diverge and they converge. They're different, but they're not mutually exclusive. So, the traditional HPC model, you want to build your own physical data center. You want to make a little local cluster in-house. What do? You buy a bunch of server boxes. That's just the way computer nerds call their servers, their computers. You add hard drives for storage. You connect the individual servers with cables, and you put it in an intranet, a local area network, a LAN. Then you install your operating system and your applications, and then you go to the client-server architecture, you log in remotely, and you start doing your work. Okay? How does this compare to the cloud computing model? In the cloud computing model, you don't have a physical data center, rather you have a virtual data center. In the virtual data center, instead of buying server boxes, you provision a bunch of instances. Remember that the instance is your little mini computer running, okay? And instead of buying hard drives for storage, you attach virtual volumes for storage, okay? So the processing and the storage and the operating system and the dependencies, they are all virtualized, okay? Then, instead of connecting servers with cables to a local area network, you create your own virtual private cloud. Within the big cloud, and this is again where the comparison to BIOS, I think, works. Within the BIOS server, if you wanted to provision resources on a cloud model, then people would be creating little virtual private clouds inside BIOS. And this is doable. This is something that we actually did for the course that we gave last year, as you may recall. Then instead of installing an operating system and all of the applications you want to use, you launch a machine image. A machine image is just a single file. It's like a disk image. It has the operating system, it has all the application, it has the dependencies, and it has everything that you need to run. And then, just like with HPC, you log in remotely and you start working, okay? So this is the difference and the similarity between HPC and cloud computing. And this is maybe the most important thing I want to get across today. Are there any questions about this? BIOS folks, yes, Jorge.
When you were talking about like cloud computer and high performance computer, you were talking about like the democratization of science in Latin America. How do you see those two like playing a role? Because I see the cloud computer model more. So, yeah.
I'm going to repeat the question until we get the microphone working. So the question was, you talked about the differences between HPC and cloud computing. And you also talked about bioinformatics as a tool for the democratization of science in Latin America and the developing world. How do these two models relate to that theme of democratization? Is that right? And so basically, I think the way that they relate is that if you have a local small group or a small lab or a university and you're just getting started with a project, you may not want to invest in your own physical data structure. Because as I said before, at first that thing may be way too big for your needs, right? So you might have to spend a lot more money that you actually need to spend. And not only money, but there will be a lot of overhead in terms of system administration, right? Running this thing takes a lot of people time and it takes a lot of money. So instead, what you might want to do is start a cloud computing effort, because that will allow you to take advantage of the fact that other people like BIOS have already made the major investment in the physical infrastructure, and you can then, or Amazon or Google, and then you can leverage that physical infrastructure and your overhead will be lower both in terms of the systems administration and the cost. And then the amount of resources that you consume can grow and shrink dynamically according to the dictates of the data. So again, the two aren't mutually exclusive. Folks in Colombia are very, very lucky to have a place like BIOS because they have done the heavy lifting of investing in the physical infrastructure. And then you can access that perhaps using the cloud model, or you could do it with Amazon or your favorite tool. So the short answer is that if you have limited resources, you might not want to invest in a local physical HPC architecture. Rather, you could use the cloud model to take advantage of the high performance computing environment that's already out there in many different platforms. Okay, thank you for that excellent question. Jorge.
Yeah. So I like actually the last line of your slide. So one of the similarities is that you still do SSH user at my domain. That will be in command line, right?
Yeah.
También ayuda from terminal. So I would like to know a bit your current experience on, I mean, you also mentioned that cloud computing has a deep learning curve. Steep learning curve. So I would like you to comment the current situation, usability, all these stories. So the whole story looks beautiful, makes total sense, but how the usability, especially for...
Right, and so again, I'll repeat, I know you have the microphone, but basically, there's a steep learning curve at the beginning. How is the usability of these platforms? Is it all command line based? So first, I'll take the command line thing. So I know we've got a bunch of biologists in the room. I'm a biologist. I went through the painful process of learning to work on the command line. I know we like graphical user interfaces. The command line has a steep learning curve, but it is very, very powerful, okay? So you must learn to work on the command line, okay? It will really, really change your life, okay? You will spend a lot of time in an initial investment, and then you'll have much more power over what you do. Please do not limit yourself to graphical user interface. Now, having said that, Many of the platforms that are more advanced, especially Amazon Web Service, provide a lot of graphical user interface that make the setup a lot easier. And I think that's important because you don't want to set up your cloud instance on the command line. That would be, even for a good bioinformaticist, that would be rough. So and Hassan will show this when he talks. So when you come set up your cloud computing environment on a mature platform like Amazon, and they're not all so mature, you will be able to, you'll open a web page, you'll go and log in, and you can do this for free. And there's a free model, and then there's a little bit more cost and a little bit more cost, and you can choose how much storage you want, how much memory you want, how many processors, and so on and so forth, and it's all run on the command line. So the mature platforms like Amazon are in fact becoming more and more usable, but students, you have to do the heavy lifting of learning how to work on the command line. Good. You first, and then we'll go back in.
What do you think about the privacy issues?
Yeah.
I mean, it's to put our data on a cloud.
Yes.
And I mean, are there alternatives to try to avoid virtual attacks? I mean, because most of your data are information that it's unpublished data.
Yes.
So what do you think about that?
So security is a huge issue. Data privacy is a huge issue. And again, the more mature platforms like Amazon are working very, very hard on that. So to give you an idea of the extent to which the security has matured, the Centers for Disease Control, which is the premier federal institution for infectious disease in the United States, has moved at least partially to Amazon to store the data of their infectious agents. So that is among the most sensitive data there is. So they are really working hard on security, and I think they've got a lot of it worked out. But having said that, if you have security issues, you would want to be very explicit and transparent in communicating with whoever the cloud provider is to nail that down, one. And two, you would probably want to rely on a more mature platform like Amazon that has worked those issues out. Good question. Yes, Ali.
More than one question. First, I want to ask why I'm buying high-performance computing. And you say that it's very expensive, although you can use cloud computing. Also, I want to know what is the cloud computing system that is the best that I can use for biotechnology.
Okay, so let me take those first because then I'll forget. So why would you even buy a high-performance computing system, right? So there's a couple reasons, and it really depends on your need. One is just inertia, meaning that we're used to doing things that way, and we want to do them that way, and we keep doing them, and we want to exert some local control over our resources. Now, that's a valid reason. It may not be the best reason, but it exists. Now, let me give you an example from my lab that is sort of related to inertia, but it's more important. You want a backup plan, always, right? So we have a high-performance computing environment at my university, Goergia Tech. We're a technology university, very sophisticated, huge, thousands of nodes, and that thing breaks down. And there's nothing that bothers me more than when my students aren't working, as Juan Esteban and Isalda can tell you, right? I get crazy. So if you're relying on a cloud service or you're provisioning resources, there could be issues with constant performance and maintenance. So I personally, in my own lab, like to have a little mini high-performance computing environment so that I can run things locally. Security might also be an option. The other thing is if you develop your own HPC resource, you can allow it to grow on a community-based model. So if you have a very domain-specific application, for example, at SEED, they have some very specific applications with respect to molecular epidemiology, you might consider the option of creating your own HPC resource, which could serve as a local community resource. And so having a big provider, this gets to your second question. Right now, the industry leader is Amazon Web Services by far. So for almost everyone, I would recommend Amazon Web Services and BaseSpace if you have Illumina data, but you can still use BaseSpace to play around. That's a long question that will take all week to answer. But the disadvantage to a big thing like Amazon is you're kind of anonymous, right? So you're dealing with some anonymity. So you'll get good feedback and they have great user support, but if you have a local HPC community like exists here in BIOS, if you're in Colombia, again, I think it's a really big advantage to be able to pick up the phone, call someone, speak in Spanish, say, hey, what about this, what about that? So those are some of the trade-offs. That's why they're not mutually exclusive. You may want to set up your own local small infrastructure or rely on local country or regional specific architecture and or go big with Amazon or Google or something like that. So they're not mutually exclusive. And you had another question. Right, so as I mentioned, right now, definitely the most mature is Amazon Web Services. And for genomics, Illumina-based